Magic, and Mystery by Allegory for Hatred. All rights go to Allegory for Hatred. I do not own this story. 51. The Philosopher's Stone. Dazai had the twins grab their stolen brooms before moving on to the next room. Gripped tight and held out, Fred and George could be ready to fly at a moment's notice. A step ahead of him, Blaze's fingers were bent around his wand. There was a spell at the tip of his tongue. And Dazai, I still think that I should be the one leading. 3 pairs of unamused looks met him head-on. What are you going to do if it's the troll, Dazai? Blaze asked, bow raised. Fred nodded. You can't use a spell on it, or fly above it, George finished, sounding strangely uneasy. He waved the broom in emphasis. But we can do all of those things. Isn't it safest if you stay in the back? Dazai rolled his eyes but conceded the point. He really wouldn't be much help against a troll, not without using no longer human at least. Though it was a bit demeaning to be shoved in the back, at least his subordinates were doing their jobs. This did feel a bit like a boss being escorted by their guards. Dazai tried to focus on that thought and not the more annoying, everyone coddles Dazai because he's useless one, regardless. Fine then. Lead the way, Dazai told them. Try not to let me get killed. He couldn't die to a troll, but that was beside the point. As they walked across the board into the next door, Dazai let his mind wander. He had faced a troll in the past, unlike the rest of his companions. Unfortunately, no amount of experience or research could really offer advice on how to defeat a mountain troll, especially not for inexperienced 11 and 13-year-olds. Still, there had to be a better way to face one down. At least now Dazai could prepare for it. Last time, Dazai's nose scrunched up in thought. Then, as they reached the door, his nose scrunched up even further for an entirely different reason. Disgust. Ugh, he whined. I forgot how atrocious mountain trolls smelled. The stench rankled the air and was so potent it leaked through the shut wooden door. Around him, Fred, George, and Blaze made similar faces. Their lips reared up, and their noses were pinched as the foul odor stole away the otherwise musty air. Fred coughed, then raised a sleeved hand to cover his nose. Inspired, Dazai moved to do the same. Well, he choked on the smell, at least we can be certain the next guard is a troll. How can Quirrell stand these things? George said behind his own cloth. Maybe the troll isn't his guard and it's just this awful stench. I don't know if I can go on. Dear brother, remember me fondly, Fred cried, voice oddly tight as he slumped over melodramatically. Blaze nodded, emphatic, and hid his face behind 2 cupped hands. It's only going to get worse once we open the door, Dazai told them offhand. Beside him, the twins paled, although there was a certain look in their eyes that, what? Fred and George blinked sheepishly. Ah, you got us. We were just thinking, Fred started. George finished. We could probably make a stink bomb that smelled like this. Can you imagine the look on Professor Snape's greasy face? They laughed, but it was quickly smothered by disgusted, choking coughs. Dazai rolled his eyes, amused by their antics. Only there was something tense and unsure in their expressions now. Was it the smell? Dazai looked between his subordinates as they struggled to withstand the rank odor. It was overwhelming, sure, but unlike the others, Dazai also knew what was coming next. The massive, hulking frame of the mountain troll. Its dead, beady eyes. The clawed hands that could crush stone. He was getting distracted. The point was, it had been a fluke Dazai defeated the troll last time. Pure luck that no longer human could kill the beast before it broke his spine. And now, having to protect both himself and his friends, Dazai would have to do a whole lot more than just get lucky. Hey, he said suddenly. Once everyone's eyes had turned to him, it was hard to tell what with how everyone had their faces mostly covered. Dazai continued, I have a plan. Something better, safer, than simply hoping they would be fast enough to avoid the troll's crushing grip. The sort of plan a leader who was sworn to protect their subordinates would come up with, really. Ooh. George cooed. He promptly stuffed his sleeve into his nostrils. "Do tell, Snakey," he said, voice nasally. Blaze hummed. He looked as calm as he always did. Well, mostly always did. "It's about time. You always have a plan, boss." "Sure." Dazai grinned behind his sleeve. "Fred, George, do you two remember the spell you used to charm Professor Quirrell's essays over winter break?" They perked up, briefly shared a glance, then nodded. "Yup, but why? We can't use that to defeat a troll." George inclined his head. "Can we?" "More or less. We're playing it safe," Dazai said with a pointed glance to Blaze. The other boy returned his look with a thoughtful nod of his own. Dazai looked back to the twins before he could fully decipher that expression. "So here's what I need you two to do. Ready." Everyone sucked in a breath and held it. "Set." Fred's fingers clenched around both brooms, shaking as they tugged away from him. "Go." Dazai whipped the door open in one swift movement. It creaked and groaned in protest before slamming against the wall. At the very same second, Fred released the brooms. They immediately shot out of his hands and took to the sky, dashing into the troll's room and zooming overhead. The magic in them was bouncy and energizing, Dazai thought. They zipped overhead, but Dazai didn't waste time in tracking their movement. Just like the smell had indicated, in the center of the wide stone room, a mountain troll was sitting hunched in on itself. This one looked no different than the troll Dazai had killed on Halloween. Just as massive and overwhelmingly smelly, for just a split second, a trill of fear bundled itself up in Dazai's chest. He felt the press of its claws dig into his spine, the stare of its dull-looking eyes bleeding through his soul. The fear that lingered from Halloween that Dazai had mostly willed himself to forget about stuck his feet to the tile. Last time, Dazai had been willing to let it kill him. Blaze's hand pressed up against the small of Dazai's back. "Let's move," he whispered, low in Dazai's ear. The charmed brooms flew just over the troll's head, dancing over its skull and behind its ears. An indescribable look crossed the monster's face. Then, like swatting at a fly, the troll reached out a massive paw to bat the brooms down. When the brooms only zoomed out of its grasp, the troll let out an enraged growl. It reached out again, spinning in circles and swatting at the air as it tried and failed to catch the offending brooms. Dazai smirked. The mountain troll was completely distracted by the charmed brooms. It hadn't even noticed their presence yet. As long as they were fast, Blaze gave Dazai a nudge on the shoulder, and the mafioso nodded back. Then, like snakes through the underbrush, Dazai and his gang snuck around the blustering mountain troll. They hugged the wall. As they slowly crept to the other end of the room, Dazai was careful to keep his steps silent. But it didn't seem like the effort was needed. The mountain troll swatted wildly around its head at the brooms, letting them sneak by completely unnoticed. When the troll smacked out fruitlessly once more, Dazai couldn't help the smile that slipped onto his face. The last of his worry withered away. Dazai didn't take his eyes off the troll, but he felt the twins come to a stop beside him. "The door's locked," George said in a hushed voice, just loud enough for Dazai to catch. "Give me a second." The troll's meaty claw struck out, bashing against one of the brooms. The broom snapped in two from the blow, then clattered onto the ground in a noisy pile of splinters. Dazai held his breath for a moment, but the troll still didn't turn around to face them. It continued to smack around the air for the second broom. Alohomora. There was a spike of magical energy to Dazai's right. He jerked unconsciously away from the stinging sensation. Across the room, the troll twitched, too. "Got it. It's unlocked now." Dazai blinked, quickly turning to the twins. Fred and George beamed at him, standing proud by the now unlocked door. "Great," Dazai said, giving them a shove. "I'm pretty sure it felt that too." Felt? Too? Dazai didn't have to turn around. He saw it in the way the twins' eyes widened, felt it in the way the air had gone tense, heard the rumble of a troll's heavy step. Having finally noticed their presence, the troll had turned its full attention onto them. It growled, then charged. "Go!" Dazai shouted at Fred, George, and Blaze. The twins had gone eerily pale, their feet frozen in place, but Dazai's voice must have shaken them from their stupor. Not a second later, Fred and George hurried through the door. They stopped just on the other side, hands grasping at the open metal and ready to close it the second everyone was through. Dazai rushed through next, a clamber of thudding steps banging behind him. George put an arm around his shoulders and tugged the mafioso in the last few steps. Dazai swung around on his heels, just in time to see Blaze slip through the door, seconds before the twins slammed it shut on the troll's face. The metallic echo rang around the silence for a long moment. Dazai let out a series of heavy breaths and heard his gang gasping around him. After a second, when it became clear that the troll would not be able to force the door open, Fred groaned. This prank involves way more peril than I anticipated. Seconded, George huffed. Dazai rolled his eyes. Then, forcing his posture upright, he said, I told you it was probably a mountain troll. What were you expecting? The twins waved him off, pouting. You're no fair, boss. Back us up, Blaze. We can't be the only ones thinking this is way too life or death for a prank. Again, Dazai rolled his eyes. He glanced to Blaze, intent on hounding his friend to back him up. This is probably too dangerous for students, Blaze started, voice slow and breathy from their unexpected sprint. But we knew what we were getting into, really. I think the real problem is that Dazai's idea of peril is different from ours. Dazai, buddy, Fred gaped. If you don't think a troll is perilous, I don't know what to do with you. I know trolls are dangerous. He huffed, but he'd run into 2 of them now. Dazai was starting to get used to the phenomenon, actually. Between the trolls and the dragon, Dazai felt he had plenty of experience with magical creatures trying to kill him. It helped that he had a built-in get-out-of-jail-free card via No Longer Human, and having loyal subordinates at his back. Dazai shrugged. If you had objections, you should have brought them up before sneaking down here. They bristled defensively, then looked at Dazai like he was the crazy one. We didn't realize this was a life-or-death operation. What about the plants that tried to kill us? Or those chess pieces? Yeah, Fred rallied. And what about that awful 3-headed D? He cut off abruptly, eyes going wide and flicking away from Dazai almost guiltily. Something hot and embarrassed burned at the mafioso's cheeks. Annoying obstacles, he said through gritted teeth, pointedly ignoring the soft look Blaze was giving him. The danger doesn't outweigh the reward. Different ideas of peril is right, Fred muttered under his breath. He shared a look with his brother, then addressed Dazai. Yeah, okay. We are definitely having a talk about your risk-taking once this is done. How are you so calm about all this? Dazai scrunched his nose up. My pranks in Chaos Division is kind of being a stick in the mood. Starting to realize this barely qualifies as a prank so much as it's a suicide mission, George said by way of answer. There was something dark and shaded in his words. Dazai blinked at that, a frown picking at his lips. Before he could choose which words to say, this isn't a suicide mission, trust me, I would know, or it's not a prank, it's for Mori, or even immortality is at stake. Are you even paying attention? Blaze cleared his throat. The other boy was a warm presence at Dazai's side. When did he get so close? We all agreed to take the Philosopher's Stone, even knowing that the professors were doing all they could to protect it. He looked between them slowly, eventually stopping on Fred and George. You 2 didn't take it seriously enough. Blaze turned his eyes onto Dazai. You knew the risks, but continued anyway. There's nothing to be done about that now. They were quiet for a second. Dazai let the words roll around in his head, wondering if he was supposed to take offense to them. What about you, Blaze? I'm just here to babysit. He frowned. So I guess that puts me on the same level as Dazai, in terms of reckless involvement. What a sobering thought. Definitely supposed to take offense then. The twins chuckled, but it felt a bit forced. We'll lecture you 2 then, Blaze. When Blaze merely shrugged, Dazai allowed himself to stand taller. Fred and George were still beside one another, looking a mix of uncertain and worried. That expression didn't look right on their faces. As boss, he wouldn't have it. A little rebellion is good for the soul, Fred said, hesitantly exasperated. But Dazai, you haven't once looked surprised that we might actually die doing this. Did you? Dazai's eyes narrowed, and he bristled unconsciously. You can complain about it later. He looked around the room, scanning the walls for the first time since they had charged in. It helped a bit, not to have to look the twins in the eyes. They almost looked angry. It burned in Dazai's chest. I have more important things to do right now. This room wasn't nearly as large as the last few had been. It wasn't nearly as threatening either. For one, there was no magical creature barreling down on them. For another, well, actually, that was about it. All of the other trials had involved trying not to be killed by a creature or charm, but looking around now, nothing like that was present. Instead, there was on long table in the middle of the room. There were 7 bottles on the table, each of a different color and size. Looks like this is Snape's guard, Dazai told the group before anyone could interrupt him. Blaze, seeming to catch on to Dazai's waning mood, followed his gaze to the table without complaint. Those are potions? Dazai nodded. From here, they just looked like oddly shaped bottles, but Dazai could feel the magic thrumming through them. Well, in 5 of them. 2 of the bottles didn't have a trace of magic energy in them, but the rest tickled under Dazai's skin from across the room. He rolled his shoulders back in displeasure, trying fruitlessly to shake off the odd sensation. Without taking his eyes off of the potions, Dazai asked the twins, "You two said Professor Snape was making potions, right? Do you recognize these?" There was a sigh from behind him, but after a second Fred and George came up from behind him to inspect the bottles close. However, the second that they stepped forward, a wall of flames rose up behind them, covering the troll's door and blocking their path out. At the same time, black flames burst to life in front of them, preventing the group from moving forward. Whoa. Dazai frowned and met Blaze's eyes across the short distance. Guess we have no choice but to move forward now. That solved the problem of the twins' sudden worry about risk-taking, at least. He looked between them. Any idea what kind of potions these are? Fred leaned over the table, face scrunched up in concentration. If the situation bothered him, he didn't let it show. The only tell that he was upset was the slight downturn of his lips. Though if it was directed at the fire trapping them or at Dazai, the mafioso couldn't be sure. "Nope," he said, popping the pea. "Actually," George cut in, not unkindly, "I might. Take a look at this, boss." With a wave of his hand, George grabbed a paper scroll off of the table. Dazai blinked, not having noticed the item before then. As Dazai crossed the room to grab the scroll, George read through it silently. Fred peeked over his brother's shoulder at whatever was written there. "What is it?" Dazai asked after a second when they didn't say anything. "Let me see." The twins shared a brief look, one of the sideways glances that inevitably meant they were being weird about him again. To prove the point, George pulled the sheet close to his chest before Dazai could reach out and take it. The brothers eyed him, expression fierce in a protective sort of way. "You can read it," George said, "but you have to promise first that you aren't going to do something reckless about it." Dazai felt his eyes twitch, then carefully schooled his expression. "Sure," he said, tasting the lie on his tongue before even registering his options. Fred rolled his eyes. "You said that awfully fast." "Sure," Dazai said purposefully slow. "We're trapped in here either way." He motioned to the flames trapping them in. "At least let me take a look." They stared at one another for a long moment, before George finally relented. Dazai took the scroll before George could change his mind, quickly reading through the paper's written content. "It's a riddle," Fred told Blaze while he read. "I guess we have to drink one of the potions to move forward, but we have to figure out the right one. 2 of the potions are wine, which might be fun to take, even if they won't help us at all. I know a few 7th years who would pay good money for that. One of the potions takes us back a room," George said. "Which is worse, considering the angry troll we left behind." Dazai hummed. He rolled the scroll back up and handed it to Blaze for the other boy to skim. "Only one of these takes us forward. The other 3 are poison." "Poison." Dazai shifted on his feet. itching to make some remark about suicide. Judging by Blaze's raised brow, the other boy expected one. But another look at the twins told Dazai that was a bad move. They were being odd enough as it was. He didn't want to push that argument open again. Didn't want to have to say, "Of course I knew we might die down here. What difference does that make?" Anyway, he could sense magic in all of the potions except for the wine, which meant even the poisons were magical. They probably wouldn't work on him anyway. Dazai blinked. "Wait." "Well," Dazai said, his brow furrowing in thought, "it's not a very complicated riddle. Snape might be good with potions, but he's not very bright, is he?" The twins laughed, and Dazai worked to very carefully keep the tension from his face. "You already know the answer? Our Dazai is too smart," Fred hummed, sounding distinctly pleased. There was an odd edge to his voice, though. "Which one is it?" "The third one, blue," Dazai replied offhand. He ignored the twins as they hovered over the smallest bottle. It was a tiny rectangular glass filled with a luminescent blue liquid. He wasn't really listening as the others started to look over the riddle again, as if double-checking his work. Dazai suddenly had much bigger problems to worry about, namely, the potion wouldn't work on him. This was an unexpected snag. Dazai had dodged dangerous beasts, had sneakily nullified Devil's Snare, and had won a game of chess with an admittedly risky gambit. He could do just about anything if he really wanted to. But despite all that, Dazai could not pass this trial. Drinking the potion would render it useless, would prevent Dazai from moving forward. Dazai, for all his genius, could only really see one option out of this scenario that ended with the Philosopher's Stone in his hands. That option being the sting of no longer human in his skull. "Great!" Fred and George cheered. For the first time since the last trial, they actually sounded pleased. Maybe the fact that there wasn't something trying to kill them helped. "Let's all drink and move forward then." George picked up the blue vial and uncapped it. He tipped it towards his nose and made a face. "It smells like onion." "What?" Fred squawked, already rushing over to smell it himself. Dazai wanted to roll his eyes, to steal the potion from their hands, and get this over with. Instead, he slowly brought a hand to his mouth, frowning deeply. No longer human prickled under his skin, burning in time with the flame between them and the stone. Burning because Dazai didn't have a choice but to nullify his way through this one. "Dazai?" He blinked, startled from his thoughts. Blaze was watching him with a blank expression. Hearing them, Fred and George looked over as well. There must have been an odd expression on Dazai's face, because they sobered up immediately. That strangely fierce look was in their eyes again, and when Fred asked, "What's wrong?" it only deepened. Dazai opened his mouth, then closed it. His head hurt. "Is this not the right potion?" George asked after a second. He slowly lowered it back onto the table. "That's correct." Then he frowned. "We're good, right?" Blaze stared between them for a second. "Why do I get the feeling that you're suddenly on a completely different page than the rest of us?" The twins briefly looked to one another. Then warily, George said, "Look, if this is about us pressuring you about risk-taking, we aren't really mad. We're just worried about you." That was weirdly good to know. But not even remotely the problem right now. Heat from the flames flickered off Dazai's face, feeling like a snap of magic that Dazai was going to have to nullify in front of Fred, George, and Blaze. He'd gone the whole year so far without revealing to anyone that he was sort of anti-magic incarnate, that he was something other. Even among ability users, Dazai stood out. Nullification was powerful. And that it wasn't just abilities, but he could nullify magic as well. Dazai would always maintain that he was right to keep it a secret this long. There were too many unknowns in the magical community still. But that would change now, because Dazai didn't have a choice but to expose no longer human if he wanted to ever leave this room and steal the Philosopher's Stone for Mori. "Hey," Blaze said, voice low, and Dazai didn't stretch one of his fake smiles on for a long few seconds. "What's wrong? Seriously." Dazai was the leader of a gang, and his subordinates might actually care about him. Fred and George were watching him with equally worried expressions, looking a second away from going to his side. Maybe petting him again like they had in the infirmary the other day. Dazai took in a deep breath and quickly considered the situation. He ran his hand down his face, then let it drop lifelessly at his side. There might be, he paused, a small problem. With the potion? Blaze asked, eyeing the blue vial suspiciously. With me. They were silent for a second. The twins' mouths dropped open, slightly agape. Blaze's brows drew together sharply. What? Are you okay? George asked, hurried. He took an aborted step forward. Did you get hurt? Dazai shook his head, quick to reassure them. No. He waved their concern off with a casual hand, and the glow of black fire glinted off of his nails. It's now or never, Dazai thought with a final mournful glance to the potions. The gang watched him, visibly concerned at Dazai's sudden change of mood. Dazai looked between them before finally settling his gaze on Blaze. There's something important I haven't told any of you, he finally said. Immediately, Fred and George stood up straighter. They didn't look distrustful, but that obvious weight of concern was back in their posture. At least it wasn't that odd, protective anger from before. But Dazai didn't turn to face the twins. He kept his eyes locked on Blaze instead. The other snake had a blank frown pasted across his features, and something considering behind his eyes, like he was mentally running through every conversation they had ever shared together. What are you talking about, Dazai? Dazai chose his words carefully. You know how I'm awful with magic? He asked after a pause. Like dreadfully bad. Sure, Fred said, frowning. It makes you super sick, but that doesn't stop you from practicing it all the time. Nodding, Dazai tilted his head towards the potions. Well, there's a reason for that. Look, I'm not going to drag this out since we're on a tight schedule. He kind of wanted to drag this out, to stall long enough that he figured out an alternative to using no longer human so brazenly in front of his friends. Because, no matter how much the thought burned, he didn't want them to know. There was a nice thick line in the ground between abilities and magic in Dazai's head. There was Mori, and then there was Snape. There was Father's guard dogs. And then there was Fred, George, and Blaze. And Dazai was about to smear that line into nothing. Mix the bad with the weirdly not bad. No other option came to mind. That potion isn't going to work on me, and I'm about to do something weird, he said. I'm trusting you not to tell anyone. So, please. They stared at him. Finally, George said, What? Why won't the potion work on you? Dazai made a vague, hand-wavy motion in his direction, before turning on his heel to face the black fire blocking their exit. It burned in front of him, hot and loud. The magic fueling it flickered and hissed, begging no longer human to stretch out and kill it. Blaze asked, voice carefully measured. Is this about the other day? Something Madame Pomfrey and Professor Snape talked with you about? His face bunched up in thought. Is the potion going to hurt you? No, Dazai hummed. He stared the fire down, even when his eyes ached and burned to watch. At his side, Dazai's fingers twitched. Well, maybe. Then what? Without warning, Dazai raised his hand to the wall of fire. He rested his palm against the blaze, ignoring the shouts ringing out behind him. There was only a split second of heat against his palm before the sharp ring of no longer human tore it away. Under his palm, the magic withered and died. The fire around his hand vanished as its fuel was nullified. Only few seconds later, the rest of the black fire was erased as well. Immediately, no longer human stopped itching under his skin. Instead, it was replaced by a louder, sharper pounding behind his eyes. Dazai let his hand fall flat against his side. There, it was done. The weight of no longer human seemed to hang in the air. A secret Dazai was forced into revealing against himself. What sort of reaction was he expecting? Even Dazai himself wasn't sure. They wouldn't have a reason to hate him for this secret ability, right? But Dazai couldn't shake the uncertainty from his mind. The damning knowledge that anything and everything could be used against him somehow. That maybe there was a good reason why none of Hogwarts's books had information on special abilities. Maybe his kind wasn't safe here. Maybe hand dropped on his head, ruffled his hair, then dropped to a comfortable spot on his shoulder. It was warm, and it immediately shook Dazai from his spiraling paranoid ideation. "You look like you were freaking out," George said, hovering over him. "Which is super weird, considering none of us were thinking anything bad about whatever you just did." "Yeah," Fred said, coming up on Dazai's other side. He was close enough that Dazai could feel him. "We're not, hey, don't look so afraid, we're just super confused. What did you do?" Dazai looked to the floor, then back to his gang. The answer pounded in the base of his skull angrily, but seeing the twins look so calm eased his nerves a lot. "I nullified the magic." Fred and George blinked. It looked like they were warring to cover up a more dramatic expression. "What? I've never heard of something like that." Blaze's face was an indescribable mask when he finally came around Dazai's side. Dazai shook his head unsurprised. He took a deep, settling breath. "I didn't think you would have. There's nothing about it in the library." Blaze's eyes widened, a look of comprehension dawning on him. Hoping to make himself more clear, Dazai continued, "It's not something I really control. Any magic I touch will inevitably become nullified." "Nullified?" the twins echoed. "You just erased a professor's spell? Like it was nothing?" Dazai paused, feeling unsteady as he quickly flipped between Blaze, the twins, and his own weary thoughts. Then, shaking himself, he told them, "Actually, yeah, that's exactly what I did." Fred and George stared at him, 1,000 questions flickering unasked behind their eyes. The intensity startled Dazai, knocking him back half a step until George's hand dropped from his shoulder. Something overwhelmed pulled up in his chest. Abruptly eager to get moving, Dazai frowned, then tipped his head back to indicate the no-open passage. "I can explain, well, kind of, but we should get the stone and get out first, if the professors catch us down here." After what felt like an hour, Blaze let out a breath. "Okay," he said, plain reassuring. "We can talk about this after." Hearing Blaze agree must have shaken the twins from their own festering inquiries, because they nodded along. "Gosh," Fred said lightly, "our little brother is full of surprises. First you start a gang to go up against the wizard mafia, and now you have superpowers? You're definitely the coolest little bro ever," George chimed in. "Don't tell Ron," Blaze snorted. Beside him, Dazai couldn't help the small smile that trickled onto his face. "Come on," Dazai said. "There should only be one room left." Slowly and as one, they walked through the doorway, where black flames once stood. The group now continued, unbidden. On the other side, the hallway was long and dark. Dazai stared down it unperturbed. "Wait," Fred said suddenly when they were about halfway down the hall. Dazai didn't stop walking, but he did arch his neck around to see his self-proclaimed big brother watching him with wide eyes. "Is that why you can't, ride a broom? Because you nullify the charms in it?" Dazai blinked, and no longer human buzzed under his skin. "That's right." He paused, looking away when he saw Fred startle and blink with awe. "The moment I touch a broom, or a wand, the magic will go away. So trying to use either is kind of a moot point." "But you can use magic," Blaze cut in. His face was scrunched up in thought. "I've seen you use incendio, or an approximation thereof." Dazai nodded. The hallway stretched on around them. "Blaze is sharp as ever," he commented with a hum. Then, feeling charitable, he elaborated, "I'm a little unclear on the details myself." He had theories, of course, but nothing concrete. The library was useless, and Mori was eternally a thorn in Dazai's side. But there was something about the confusion in everyone's faces, the way that they weren't persecutory at all, that put Dazai somewhat at ease. It was as if, for the first time in all his 11 years, Dazai was sharing just an ounce of his burdens. Honesty was an odd feeling. He felt strangely light, walking into the room that followed. Ignoring the wide-eyed looks the others kept sending him helped a little too. It was another small room, like the potions trial had been previously. The stone walls were close and lit by a long row of flickering torches, but what caught Dazai's attention immediately was the tall golden-framed mirror standing in the center of the room. It was at least 3 times Dazai's height and about as wide. "A mirror?" Fred asked, walking further into the room before stopping. "Haven't we beaten all the guards? I don't see the Philosopher's Stone." Dazai walked up to stand beside Fred, then looked around the room. His eyes naturally came to rest on the mirror. A sharp frown pieced itself together on his face as his headache suddenly pounded to life tenfold. The mirror was full of magic. It was definitely charmed in some way, though Dazai didn't recognize any of the spells on it. Whatever it was, though, it was powerful enough to make Dazai's vision waver from across the room. Dazai looked into the mirror and squinted to inspect it closer when he realized the others gasped around him, staring into the mirror with shock. There was no reflection in the mirror. Instead, it was a tall, empty expanse. The only thing reflected in it was the sharp flicker of firelight. Dazai opened his mouth to comment on the lack of reflection when Fred said, "Do you guys see that? It's George and I pranking the whole school." "Only the best prank I've ever seen," George agreed, pushing himself forward to stare into the mirror. But no, the mirror was still blank. Dazai narrowed his eyes at it, willing the image to appear, but nothing did. Maybe no longer human was nullifying it. Only it didn't feel like his ability was active, and he wasn't even touching the mirror, so... "I don't see that," Blaze said suddenly. "Oh, me neither." Dazai nodded. "I see," the other snake hummed, then shot a quick glance to Dazai. "Our loyalty club." A small smile crossed his face. "We look happy." "What?" Something heavy pulled up in Dazai's chest. He stared into the mirror, eyes searching, but couldn't make anything like that appear. While everyone else was seeing something they wanted, Dazai was seeing... Oh. He looked to the mirror. It remained empty. "This must be the mirror of Arist," Dazai told them, keeping his voice tight and level. "I read about it in the library. Supposedly, it shows the viewer the deepest, most desperate desires of their heart." "Oh," Fred gaped. He leaned in closer to stare at his reflection. Blaze opened his mouth, then closed it. Almost imperceptibly then, he leaned closer into Dazai's side. The mafioso allowed it. He was too busy glaring into the blank depths of his deepest desire to really care. Nothing. Was there really nothing that Dazai desired? It bubbled up inside him, hot and unwelcome. Nothing in this world would ever make him happy. No family or aspiration, no grand achievement, like the twins saw. Simply no reflection, like looking at a blank canvas, but knowing that something should have been painted there. Something. Anything at all. Dazai blinked and the mirror showed him the stone floor. Blinked again, a flicker of candlelight from the far wall. Where was Dr. Mori, smiling at him, proud? Where was Father, saying he did a good job? Useless, hopeless wishes like that. To be normal and happy? Where was his body, hanging limp from a noose? Dazai glowered, an irrational, aimless anger building up in his chest. It wasn't that he was surprised, really, but to be faced with his own inhumanity like this hurt. "So?" George said, laughing, as he saddled up to Dazai's side and leaned into his shoulder. He was probably beaming, but Dazai would have to move his neck to see it. "What do you see, kiddo?" "I bet it's you lording over the other students, right? Dazai's mafia reigning supreme?" It was absolutely nothing. Dazai couldn't even see himself, because no perfect world could ever include him in it. He would never be happy. Dazai tried for a smile, but couldn't see his reflection to know if it looked right or if it was too brittle around the edges. Whatever weight he had lifted by telling his gang about no longer human returned as a crushing debt. "Yeah, that's it." His voice didn't feel like his own. Hollow, far away. Blaze frowned at him, a cease aching between his brows. There was something infinitely cautious in his eyes, so whatever expression Dazai put on must have not been very convincing. They were standing very close now. Then, without fanfare, Blaze slowly linked his fingers with Dazai. Their held hands hung there, intertwined, for a long moment. It was a warm, unfamiliar weight, and Dazai tore his stare away from the mirror to blink down at them numbly. "Is that a lie?" Blaze asked. Someone made a choked-sounding noise beside him. Dazai looked up and saw the twins watching him and Blaze with a matching pinch between their brows. Ah, he must not have sounded convincing at all then. Dazai shook himself forcibly from his own aching self-pity, but didn't release Blaze's hand from his own. "Do any of you see the stone?" he asked, instead of answering. He looked around dully to search for the stone, but the only magical signature in the room came from the mirror of Erased. It was powerful, giving off magic in steady waves that prickled under Dazai's skin and made his head spin. "No," Blaze said after a second. He gave Dazai's fingers a squeeze. "I don't see it." "Did either of you find anything?" Fred and George glanced to each other, then shook their heads. "Only what the mirror is showing us," George said. "But that's not the stone. Are we sure it's in this room?" Dazai nodded mutely, his eyes unconsciously returning to the mirror's empty reflection once again. A sharp pain pierced through his brain. He made an aborted movement to pinch the bridge of his nose, but instead his hand merely twitched in Blaze's. Once again, Dazai was struck with the realization that the mirror was exuding a lot of magic, almost too much magic, for being just a charmed mirror. Dazai tried to focus on the sensation. There was a silent buzz of energy coming from the mirror itself. A sharp, complicated layer of charms washed over the whole thing. But there was something else as well. Tucked underneath the mirror and its many, many charms was a different magical signature entirely. Dazai had to close his eyes to focus on it fully. It felt old and unfamiliar, and exceedingly, excessively, powerful. "The Philosopher's Stone," he said, opening his eyes. "It's in the mirror." The others blinked at him, then turned back to the mirror of Erased. Blaze tilted his head. "How do we get it out?" Dazai shrugged. He looked around the frame of the mirror but didn't find any indication that it would open up. Following his lead, the twins carefully stepped around the back of the mirror. After a second, they came back around, shaking their heads. So there was no way to open the mirror manually. Was he missing something? Maybe it was Dazai's own horrid presence, reflectionless, preventing success. Or maybe... "I don't think we're supposed to be able to get the stone," he said with a thoughtful frown. "It's locked in there so the professors can have evidence Quirrell tried to get it, but he won't actually get it." Fred and George opened their mouths, then closed them again. "What do you want to do, Dazai?" Blaze asked after a moment. Dazai closed his eyes, willing his nausea to subside. When he opened them again, the mirror of Erased towered over him, an empty mask. Carefully, Dazai pried his fingers out of Blaze's hold. He held them hovered over the mirror's glass sheen. "We aren't meant to get the stone, but Dumbledore doesn't know about my ability," he almost said, but held his tongue last second. "Me." Someone gasped, surprise in their voice when they asked, "You mean your, nullification thing?" Wordlessly, Dazai raised his finger out to the mirror. No longer human, spiked painfully. The second he poked the glass, it shattered into a million violent pieces. The shards clattered against the floor and skittered across the room. Whatever charms made the mirror functional shattered as well. When Dazai drew his hand back, his knuckles were bloodied from the projectile glass shards. Once the broken glass settled, Blaze, Fred, and George rushed to Dazai's side at the face of the broken mirror. "Are you okay?" George asked. Dazai blinked in his direction, frowning when he noticed. The others were also now wearing a few cuts from the glass. "Why did it explode?" Dazai took a step back from the mirror but stopped when more glass cracked beneath his shoe. "Not sure," he said, humming. He raised his hand to his face to inspect the cuts there. His fingers were red and wet, but not especially hurt. Thoughtlessly, He drew a bloodied finger to his mouth and licked the appendage clean. The magic must have been keeping it held together. Blaze, still at Dazai's side, looked back to the mirror with a contemplative frown between his eyes. Now that the glass was shattered, there was only the golden frame left standing. Dazai followed his gaze, looking in the now broken mirror for anything of interest. Clink. A faint red light glowed in the corner of Dazai's vision. Slowly, he turned his head to the floor, eyes skipping over the glass shards. A small red gem no larger than a quarter rolled out of the shattered mirror and came to a stop at his foot. Dazai blinked. He felt weak and dizzy at the sudden intense wave of magical power washing off of the gemstone. It felt ancient and infinite, he thought distantly. Numbly, Dazai bent down. He heard the others ask what he was doing, but Dazai ignored them. Withdrawing the silk blue bag from his cloak, Dazai carefully maneuvered the stone into his hand. He was diligent not to touch the stone, knowing both that he would destroy it, and that it would make him sick for weeks. Dazai pulled the drawstrings closed, cutting of the Philosopher's Stone's red glow from the world. It still hummed with noxious power in his palm. It was his. It was Mori's. It wasn't Quirrell's. When Dazai looked up at last, his gang was watching him with wide, curious eyes. Dazai held up the bag. "The Philosopher's Stone," he grinned. "I've got it." They blinked. Then one by one, Fred, George, and Blaze grinned back. 52 undercover. "What do you mean Dazai has a superpower?" Ron's mouth fell agape, a look of brief annoyance pinching his expression together. Fred and George leaned forward, conspiratorial, with matching grins. Dazai raised a hand to cut them off before they could take their teasing too far. Their group consisted of Dazai, Blaze, the twins, Hermione, and Ron. They were bunched up together at far end of the Gryffindor table during breakfast, whispering amongst themselves in light of the previous night. Every so often their group would get an odd look from the other students. Dazai pointedly ignored the watching eyes, only looking up every so often to glare at anyone who wandered close enough to eavesdrop. "Keep your voice down," Dazai whispered harshly. "It's not a superpower, Ron. It's a secret." Fred and George called it a superpower first, Ron countered, petulant. Dazai merely shrugged, and Ron glowered. "So you can just erase magic?" Hermione jumped in. She was practically bouncing in her seat. The gleam in her eyes said she was beyond intrigued about this new revelation. When Dazai nodded, she continued. "Is it just charms and potions? Or does that include animagi and curses? And what about—" "Easy there, Hermione," Fred said with a laugh. George tittered at his side. "This isn't a book report." Dazai sighed, then rested his head in the palms of his hands. Not for the first time, Dazai wished the student dining tables would manifest coffee. After their midnight excursion to get the stone was complete, Dazai and his gang didn't return to their dorms until after 4 a.m. He and Blaze had sneaked into their common room unnoticed and promptly said goodnight to one another. Dazai had been hoping for a short nap before having to get up for breakfast, but had been too distracted by the Philosopher's Stone to get much rest. All night, the waves of power rolling off the stone prickled at the edge of his awareness. It kept him awake. That, and the turbulent buzz of thoughts in Dazai's head asking, "What next?" Rubbing at his eyes, Dazai rolled his neck to watch his friends sleepily chat. Looking at his little group, Dazai couldn't regret revealing the nature of his ability to them. Although he'd still kept most of the truth to himself, Dazai couldn't bring himself to quite regret revealing no longer human. He was way too tired for that now. Hermione was still bubbling with excitement when Dazai blinked over at her. "I've never heard of something like this before. I have so much research to do." Dazai frowned into his palm, which was littered with more bandages than normal now, thanks to the glass cuts. "You won't find anything," he told her idly. She titled her head. Then, comprehension dawning in her eyes, Hermione gasped, "That's what you've been researching all year." Dazai raised his hand in a vague gesture. "And you haven't found anything?" "Nope." Dazai hummed, then yawned. His whole face prickled with exhaustion. "There's nothing to find. Magic and I just don't get along." Hermione bit her lip, clearly still excited at the prospect of some new, grand research endeavor. Dazai knew, realistically, there was nothing he could do to stop her from looking. Not that it really mattered. There really wasn't anything about abilities in the library, let alone about nullification abilities. There was absolutely no way for Hermione to trace him back to special abilities or the Port Mafia. Thinking this, Dazai let some of the tension bleed out of his shoulders. It wasn't hard to melt into the table after that. He was exhausted. When he peeked up from behind his arms, Hermione wore an odd look on her face. In askance, Dazai raised a lazy brow. She let out a breath. "I'm sorry, Are you sure there isn't any research I can DDO?" She bit into an apple, looking annoyed. "Maybe it's a curse. I can study curses." "You can study it, but there's nothing to find." Mori probably knew something about no longer human and its relationship to magic. Mori always had information, but the insufferable doctor never told him anything, and Dazai had finally come to the conclusion that even trying to ask Mori was a useless endeavor. Speaking of Mori, Dazai had a fresh, unopened letter sitting on his bed this week. He'd have to make time to read over it later and write a proper response telling Mori he'd collected the Philosopher's Stone. Maybe not today, though. No, today Dazai was planning to sleep and sleep and sleep until the stone stopped giving him such a bad headache. Sitting up straight, Dazai rested his hand on his chest. The small pouch tucked in there was a heavy, powerful weight. It was sickening to be so close to the stone, but Dazai didn't feel right about leaving it behind in his room. It was safer that way. Once Quirrell realized the stone was already stolen, Dazai could only imagine what he would do. A desperate mafioso who had failed his mission. Right. Dazai felt a trickle of fear run up his spine at just the thought. Lucky for Dazai, he was the more successful of the two mafiosos here. The stone hummed with ancient energy in his pocket, a token of his victory over Quirrell's less effective mafia. Dazai dropped his hand from his chest and turned his eyes to where the professor's table was just starting to fill up. Quirrell was already seated, passing a faraway look around the room. Snape and McGonagall were chatting quietly amongst themselves as they ate. Quickly hobbling to the table, Hagrid seemed to be in a hurry to sit and eat. "I don't get why you kept this from us," Ron was saying when Dazai finally tuned them back in. "But I guess you always have been a bit." Dazai blinked. "What?" "Paranoid," Ron finished, wearing a quirk to his lips that could have either been amusement or derision. "Weird. I don't know." "Aren't you the paranoid one, giving our friendship rules?" Dazai deadpanned. When Ron didn't snipe back at him after a too long moment, Dazai turned his full attention to the Gryffindor. Ron wore an expression like he was remembering something unpleasant. Seeming to realize everyone's eyes were on him, Ron shook himself. "Is that why you always get sick after doing magic, then?" Abruptly, Blaise sat up straighter, his expression hardening. The twins seemed to shift as well, but didn't look nearly as urgent. Dazai shrugged. "That's the working theory." Then, anticipating Blaise's overprotective objections, he quickly tacked on. "Madame Pomfrey is looking into it, more or less." She was missing a lot of the details, but Dazai didn't trust the doctor nearly as much as he did his gang members. Besides, it wasn't like she was going to find a cure to no longer human anyway. "Oh," Blaise hummed. "That's good." He must have been remembering their various adventures in the infirmary. Dazai let the snake have a moment to collect his thoughts, turning to eye the other students instead. The other Gryffindors were keeping a wide berth of their little group, whether due to Dazai's being a Slytherin, or the glares he kept flashing out. Dazai couldn't be sure. Over at the Slytherin table, Dazai caught sight of Pansy and Draco sitting together. "So it's a superpower and a handicap," George said sagely. "Hey, does that mean you could have accidentally nullified the Philosopher's Stone, too? If you hadn't been so careful handling it, I mean." Dazai opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, his eyes passed over the professors. Most of the staff were present now. Snape, McGonagall, Pomfrey, Sprout, and a few others, but that was hardly significant enough to capture his attention. Instead, it was the way they were all huddled together, frantically whispering to one another that made Dazai's breath catch. Hagrid was at the center of them, gesturing wildly with his hands. Every few seconds, the professors would search around the room for something. When Snape's eyes flicked to Quirrell for the 10th time, Dazai knew. They've realized that the Philosopher's Stone is missing. "Hey," Dazai interrupted Fred before he could finish telling a joke. "Looks like something big happened." The others blinked, immediately turning to follow Dazai's turned-up chin. They followed the point of his chin in the direction of the professors, then quickly snapped their eyes back to Dazai. He let a small grin flicker across his face. "They know about last night," Fred said in a hushed but energetic voice. Beside him, George vibrated with a manic sort of excitement. "Wish I could have a better look at their faces right now." Hermione made a low sound. "Just being acquainted with troublemakers like you lot makes me sick. I can't believe you roped me into this." "If it's for a good reason," Ron said, trailing off with a brief glance to Dazai. The mafioso shrugged. He turned back to watch the professors, morbidly interested in watching them flail and panic. Sure enough, they were looking distressed. Dazai supposed that losing an immortality-granting stone would do that to someone, though. He passed his gaze between them, then finally came to a stop. Quirrell was staring at him from across the room. His expression was a dark and heavy thing, but his eyes were wide and almost surprised. Dazai titled his head back, split a wide, childish grin across his face, and waved. Quirrell's mouth jaw dropped like a stone. Something dangerous in his eyes, something appraising. Not even a second passed, and Quirrell schooled his expression. His head whipped to the side, and he said something to the group. Dazai followed his gaze to see Professor Snape, who must have said something to get Quirrell's attention like that. For a split second, Dazai thought he saw Snape's eyes flit to him. But the moment was too short to be sure. That was enough brazen ogling for now, Dazai thought. Purposeful, he turned back to Fred and George. "Hey," he said, catching their attention away from where the staff was gathered. "Just in case, I want you two to come up with an alibi. I'm sure Ron and Hermione would love to help." "You think they know it was you?" Ron asked, a little uneasy. "I wouldn't rule out the possibility," Dazai said after a pause. He glanced to Hermione, who was nervously shifting in her seat. "Stop looking over at them or you'll make us look guilty." "You are guilty," Dazai huffed. "More guilty, then. Anyway, I'm not the one who was waving at them." "That's different," Dazai said, but didn't bother to expand on the topic. Trying to explain the strange hostility between himself and Professor Quirrell wasn't something Dazai ever really intended to bother with. "In the meantime, what about us?" Dazai frowned. He looked to Blaise, waiting for the boy to continue. "We can't use the same alibi as Fred and George, since that would put us in the Gryffindor common rooms all night." Blaise leaned forward to rest his head in his palm. "And I don't think Pansy is going to cover for you. Draco might help him, but Blaise was right. If they tried to squeeze a fake alibi out of Pansy and Draco, there was a pretty good chance that Pansy would use the opportunity to sabotage Dazai." Humming thoughtfully, Dazai mentally ran through their options. He let his eyes wander back to the professors. They weren't bunched together anymore. Now they were all seated at the table in perfect silence, lips pressed into thin, white lines. None of them even reached for their food. A strange dread seemed to loom over their table. Dazai couldn't bring himself to feel sorry, seeing as he was still the victor in this situation. The only two left standing were Snape and Hagrid. They marched across the room with purpose. "Off to see the headmaster?" Snape guided Hagrid through the rows of student tables. Dazai's gang went abruptly silent as they passed. For a brief second, Snape met Dazai's eyes. Then he left the great hall without a word. "We'll figure it out," Dazai said, breaking the long silence. "I always do, you know." Albus Dumbledore should have been at breakfast with them, but he wasn't. With the Philosopher's Stone in such a precarious position and Quirrell still silently scheming, Severus had considered holing himself in his office as well. Poring over papers and plans had certainty, seemed like a reasonable thing to do. To learn everything they could in order to strike Quirrell before the stone went missing, only at the cost of a reasonable breakfast hour? Severus was all on board for that. But then Hagrid had burst in through the great hall, panicked and whispering about a break-in, and very suddenly their entire plan had crumbled to bits. "I was just coming over to feed Fluffy when I saw the trapdoor was left open," Hagrid said, voice wobbly. Severus drew up his nose at the mention of the three-headed dog. Fluffy. What a childish name for such a monstrous beast. Severus glanced over his shoulder, see the panic written clearly across Hagrid's face. The bearded man gave Fluffy a hearty pat on one of their heads. The dog slobbered clumsily in return. When Severus looked back to the trapdoor, he was sure of it, someone had been in here. Albus hummed, stroking his long, white beard in thought. There was something tense in his expression that Severus couldn't make out. "It is possible," the headmaster said after a short moment, "that the Philosopher's Stone was not stolen. After all, Quirrell has not yet fled the campus, as I suspect he would have had he been successful." Severus nodded, but didn't feel any sense of relief wash over him at the prospect. Quirrell had completely evaded their watch last night. It was more horrifying than anything else. How had the man slipped the many, many eyes Hogwarts had on him? At the very least, the Mirror of Eris should not have relinquished its hold on the stone to Quirrell. As Albus spoke, he slowly levered the trapdoor fully open. "I will need to refortify. The guards, Severus?" "I'm coming," he barked out. Dumbledore didn't look surprised, merely offered a tight-looking smile. "Very well," Dumbledore said with a hum. He began climbing down the door at once. "Rubius," he addressed Hagrid, "stand guard until we return." "Aye." Without another word, Dumbledore and Snape descended into the chamber below. Their descent was cast in perfect shadow, save for the sliver of light coming from above. After a long, quiet moment, both Snape and Dumbledore reached the floor below. Something tickled at the back of Severus's mind. "It seems," Albus began. His voice no longer held any of its usual pleasantness. It was serious and contemplative, the strategic mastermind most of the wizarding community would only ever hear rumor of, that our intruder has completely destroyed Pomona's devil's snare. Severus blinked, glancing to the floor as he realized what was wrong with the room. What had once been covered in the deadly, choking vine was now cold and barren. There were a few thick roots and leaves scattered about the room, but otherwise nothing remained. His frown deepened. "No scorch marks," Severus commented with a bite. "It wasn't burnt." "Indeed," Albus hummed. "So how was it destroyed so utterly?" The question lingered in the air for a long moment, but no answer manifested itself. Severus bit his tongue, scowling at the shadowed room. How had Quirrell done this? It shouldn't have been possible to destroy the magical plant like this. But sure enough, Albus kicked a withered vine across the floor, a contemplative look to his face. Finally, he turned from the floor and started towards the next room. "I will ask Pomona what she believes may have been responsible." Although Severus nodded, he wasn't feeling at all satisfied with that conclusion. Still, he held his tongue and followed along in silence. As they walked, his quiet hope that Quirrell didn't have the stone began to falter more and more. Against all odds, the destroyed devil's snare was not the most perplexing thing they found in the stone's chambers. Dumbledore guided Severus through a massive room with a frown, staring down at a pile of broken and twitching keys. Quirrell had not only passed the trial, but he had completely demolished it. Then, passing through Minerva's room, they found the board a smattering of shattered chess pieces that indicated a swift and certain victory for Black. But the clean victories over those rooms held nothing over what came after. The Mountain Troll's room had seemingly been bypassed entirely. Aside from the two broken brooms on the floor, Severus wouldn't have even guessed that the intruder made it this far. Just as Severus was beginning to think, of course this room was easy. It was Quirrell's own guard, after all. The next room completely threw him. "Quirrell didn't drink the potion," he said, mouth dropping open. Dumbledore came up to his side, expression unreadable. Indeed, he turned his gaze up to where the firewall was supposed to be. And yet, our intruder seems to have passed through. That's not possible, Severus ground out. He took a step forward to inspect the potions, and while they had certainly been moved, not even one had been ingested. How did he trick the spell? I'm not sure he did, Albus hummed. At Severus's clear disbelief, he continued in a measured tone, Take a look, Severus. It is as if the fire-blocking charm were never in place to begin with. In point, Albus walked directly through where the flames were meant to pass. Severus glowered. You think he just erased the spell? Albus tipped his head back, contemplative. I see no other alternative, however improbable. Impossible, it may appear. Dumbledore met his eyes, then quickly began his march into the next room. There was a renewed sense of urgency in his steps, one Severus hadn't seen in years. Not since the First Wizarding War, not since, it seems, Voldemort. Severus winced minutely as Dumbledore spoke. May have more power than we anticipated to do such a thing. Fear. That's what the look on Albus's face was. He's afraid that the stone was already stolen, that we've already lost. A jolt of worry shocked through Severus at the realization. He hurried to Dumbledore's side immediately, rushing to reach the final room. Crack! Severus came to an abrupt stop. Slowly, he lifted his foot to see what he had stepped on. Glass. It was scattered all across the stone floor, tiny shards of... Realization struck Snape, and his eyes widened. Albus seemed to have reached the same conclusion as he shot through the room like a lightning bolt sent free. Severus followed, his heart thudding in his chest. It couldn't be. The mirror of Arist stood in the middle of the room. Glass shattered out from it like an explosion. The mirror was broken. Merlin's beard, Severus swore under his breath. Dread pooled in his stomach. Quirrell. Albus nodded, grave. The Philosopher's Stone has been stolen. He took in a deep breath, seeming to calm whatever storm of emotions was brewing beneath the depths. Or perhaps he just smothered it, tempered it until he could fully panic later. For all his flaws, one of Dumbledore's greatest strengths had always been his ability to remain level-headed in even the most dire of circumstances. Even now, when Severus was standing beside him, one breath away from full-on panic. The mirror of Arist is held together by countless complex charms and spells, Albus continued, resting his palm on the broken mirror's frame. To dismantle them all in such a manner would take incredible magical control. Quirrell doesn't have that level of power, Severus replied, willing himself to remain as collected as the headmaster was. This shouldn't even be possible. Yet here we are. Albus dropped his hand to his side. I suspect, he said haltingly, we have underestimated Voldemort's influence, Severus. Severus frowned, a furrow in his brows, as he worked out Albus's meaning. After a pause, he ground out, he has an ally in the school. The realization shot through him like a knife. They had let someone slip by completely unnoticed. But all of the other professors had been working at Hogwarts for some time now, which meant... The second realization was worse. A student? Albus closed his eyes, at least having the decency to look abashed for suggesting the idea. Or perhaps not. I find it difficult to believe a student would be capable of this. He gestured to the shattered glass in point. But you know as well as I that it would be impossible for anyone to sneak onto Hogwarts ground without our knowing. It is impossible for a student to do this, Severus growled. But at the same time something had sparked in his mind. A memory, an idea, a lingering concern. Something must have shown on his face because not a second later, and Albus calmly inquired, Severus? Dazai Osamu. The boy who wandered Hogwarts at all hours of the night. Was he getting lost, or was he looking for something? The boy who smiled like he has something to hide, who had spent a sizable chunk of the school year sitting right in Quirrell's palm, who had bandages on his fingers this morning like he'd punched a mirror. Holding a breath, Severus spit out a tense, Dazai Osamu. Albus's eyes narrowed. You've mentioned him before. He turned his full attention to Severus. momentarily abandoning his post at the broken mirror of Arist. The boy Quirrell was mentoring. Indoctrinating, Snape corrected with a hiss. Because that must have been what it was, right? Damn. He should have stepped in as soon as he heard about Quirrell's interest in Dazai, regardless of Albus's hesitance. We cannot be certain of the boy's involvement, Severus, Albus reminded him. This was accomplished by an exceptional wizard after all. Dazai Osamu is only a first year, isn't he? He is. But that doesn't change anything. Severus glared, no longer hiding his open hostility for the situation. I told you Quirrell's involvement with my snake was dangerous. This refusal to consider anything other than your so-called bigger picture is what's landed us in this situation. Albus raised a hand, cutting off any of Severus's further arguments. That is enough, Severus, he said, any anger muted behind a knowing gaze. Severus took in a shaking breath. I do not believe your student is capable of something like this, Albus said clearly. However, if you suspect he may have information about Quirrell, I will permit you to interrogate the boy on this matter. Lips falling into a thin line, Severus practically growled. He managed to hold his tongue, if only for the fact that Albus had finally turned to leave the room. Severus followed behind without complaint. It wasn't until they were out of the dungeons and back with Hagrid and Fluffy that Severus had calmed himself enough to speak once more. I will talk with Mr. Dazai immediately, he confirmed. He took a step to quickly leave the room, but another voice stopped him short. Dazai? Hagrid's rough voice inquired. Oh. So you were the professor those boys were. Helping out, Severus. Don't see why they couldn't have just told me that. Severus stopped dead in his tracks. That familiar dread seemed to be smothering him whole now. Whirling on his heels, Severus stomped forward until he was practically pressed up against Hagrid's chest. What? Hagrid stumbled back half a step, earning a whine from Fluffy when he abruptly stopped petting one of their heads. Was I not supposed to say so? What exactly are you referring to? Hagrid blinked, then paled. He started petting Fluffy again and stood closer to them as if they were anchoring him down. His eyes quickly shot to Dumbledore, who Severus noticed had also suddenly grown very serious. The boys, Dazai and those Weasley twins, came to my hut last month asking about the Philosopher's Stone. Told me one of their professors was having them investigate it. Hagrid shuffled on his feet, looking decidedly ill. Was that? Were you not? Severus drew in a sharp breath. He knew he should have kept a closer eye on that problem child. Dazai was clearly still involved with Quirrell, despite what the boy had said that night over tea. Severus should have known, should have kept pushing instead of giving Dazai some space. So many should-haves, and not the least of them was letting Dazai continue to spiral down his clearly self-destructive path. I believe, Albus said carefully, you'll want to interrogate the boy now, Severus. Severus found Dazai and his mismatched group all clustered together in the library some 30 minutes later. It wasn't an unusual place to find the boy, really. What was odd was that Dazai wasn't even pretending to be reading any of the books piled around him. Instead, he was lagging forward in his seat, looking half asleep at best. Most of their group, Blaze, Fred, and George, were similarly lazing around the table. On closer inspection, Severus realized it was really only Hermione and Ron who were flipping through books. He squinted down at the textbook currently being propped open, weird wizarding dilemmas and their solutions, making nose hairs into ringlets. Hermione read aloud, a disgruntled look on her face. That's not helpful at all. Dazai grunted, nonplussed. Told you there was nothing to find. Well, Severus thought with a frown. This wasn't exactly the serious conversation he would have expected from a group that supposedly just stole an ancient and incredibly powerful artifact. Still, there has to be something. Abruptly, Severus cleared his throat, cutting off whatever literary tangent Hermione had been about to begin. Immediately, several pairs of eyes shot to him. Dazai's were among them, the boy sitting up ramrod straight and staring at him with narrowed eyes. Professor, Dazai greeted, taking charge of the conversation before it even began. Around him, Dazai's friends seemed to acquiesce to his leadership easily. They went quiet, allowing Dazai to speak. Severus noted the interaction with a small frown. "What brings you here? Come to pester Blaze for letting you get attacked by a fire salamander?" "Hey," Blaze objected. Severus huffed out a breath. "No," he growled. "I need to speak with you. Now." Dazai blinked but didn't look surprised. Hovering over their book, Ron and Hermione shuffled in their seats. The Weasley twins tensed up as well. While Severus didn't take his stare off of Dazai, he did clock the reactions. They looked nervous, afraid. Then, with grim certainty, Severus knew. Something definitely happened last night. "Damn it, problem child." "Now?" Dazai asked with a yawn. "Now," Severus said, carefully levering a hiss into his voice. "The rest of you do not move. I will be back to speak with you momentarily." Dazai stood from his chair, but not before giving his friends a nod and a measured look each. Only then did the young snake push his chair back under the table and walk to Severus's side. "Where to, Professor?" he asked, voice deceptively calm. Severus watched in silence for a short moment, before finally replying, "My office." Having said that, Severus firmly gripped Dazai's shoulder in his hand. He ignored the muted flinch that ran through the boy, letting his own dread and anger fortify the motion. Gripping hard, Severus pushed Dazai through the library and into the halls. Dazai let himself be pulled along without complaint, despite looking almost sick at the hand on his shoulder. Every so often as they walked, Dazai would shoot him a short, thoughtful glance. However, it wasn't until Severus had locked his office door and sat down behind his desk that the boy actually spoke. "Dragging me all the way over here, you at least going to make tea again?" Severus growled, low and heavy. That weary anger bubbled to life tenfold. Anger, but not at Dazai. No, Severus had known Dazai all year, known that he was a troubled young boy. He was angry with himself for letting Quirrell manipulate his snake. Angry at Quirrell for being what he was. Angry at Albus. Just angry. And that cheeky, self-satisfied grin on Dazai's face wasn't helping in the slightest. "Last night," he bit out, no longer willing to pretend at pleasantries. "What did you do, boy?" Dazai blinked, then looked away. Severus frowned when he realized that he still couldn't quite read the expressions painted across that face. It was silent for a long moment, and Severus almost thought to start shouting. If he wasn't still reeling from how Dazai could flinch away from the slightest movements, at times. "Hagrid has already informed me of your investigation into the Philosopher's Stone," he ground out when Dazai didn't respond for too long a moment. "Do not think that you can lie to me." Something must have jarred Dazai from his thoughts, because he turned to stare at Severus with a frown between his brows. After a second, that odd expression fell away into confusion. Dazai said, clearly choosing his words very carefully when he continued. "I was just curious about it, sir." "What does that have to do with?" Last night, there had been a slight pause in Dazai's words, and Severus latched onto it like a starving piranha. "Do not play games with me. I may have been willing to overlook your behaviors in the past, but conspiring against Hogwarts is not one of them." Unexpectedly, Dazai didn't recoil at all in response to the accusation. Severus had anticipated something, given how shaken the boy could be at times, especially when confronted by authority. He knew. That night over tea, for instance. Now, however, Dazai did little more than bristle. Once again, Severus was overcome with the feeling that Dazai's expression was a lie somehow. "I have nothing against Hogwarts," Dazai said, defensive, after a short pause. Severus felt his eyes narrow, then let out a weary breath. Dazai could be lying. The boy was certainly calm enough to manage it, unlike he had been on that night. This interrogation was getting them nowhere fast. Biting the inside of his mouth, Severus called upon his magic to summon his tea kettle to his side. He started heating it over a small flame as Dazai watched. Once the water was heating, he turned his full focus back onto Dazai. Explain everything," Severus said carefully. How did you learn about the stone? Did Quirrell tell you about it? Severus drew 2 mugs magically to the desk, never once removing his eyes from Dazai. In his seat across the table, Dazai looked the picture of calm. It was offsetting. Any student would look worried when being interrogated by their professor, especially one with a reputation like Severus. But Dazai looked at ease, if not a little confused. It wasn't right. Not when Severus knew the boy could panic and fret. Had seen Dazai do just that in the very same chair he sat in now. As was becoming too frequent a phenomenon with his problem child, Severus's immediate assessment was that Dazai Osamu's entire persona was fake. Ah, Dazai said. Well, I heard about that from you actually. Severus blanked. Tilting his head, Dazai offered him a slim smile and riled up that private anger in Severus once again. I'm sure I would recall telling you such a thing. You didn't tell me, Perse, Dazai said, and that was suddenly all Severus needed to know. His eyes narrowed, sharp. When? Over winter break, in the woods. I followed Professor Quirrell into the forest and decided to hang around for a while when I heard my very favorite Professor Snape was sneaking around too. A long frown drew itself across Severus's face. He covered up the expression by busying himself with the water, which was nearly heated now. He pulled it off the magical fire before it could start hissing more than it already was. While preparing 2 cups, Severus concluded, Quirrell didn't tell you about it. No. Dazai looked to the tea, then back to Severus. I told you my remedial lessons stopped after break when Professor Quirrell decided he wanted to be a stick in the mud. Anyway, I thought this Philosopher's Stone sounded interesting, but I didn't go looking for it or anything. Then, showing his first real indication of discomfort since their meeting began, Dazai asked, What does any of this have to do with last night? Severus weighed his options. If Dazai really didn't know what was going on, revealing that the Philosopher's Stone had been stolen could be disastrous. But if the boy was involved and was merely lying about it, they couldn't afford to let the Philosopher's Stone slip out of Hogwarts' hands. Something still wasn't adding up, though. Dazai was involved with Quirrell, but didn't seem to be aligned with anyone, let alone the Dark Lord. He snooped around the castle and was dodgy about most things. Severus let out a breath, then gestured to Dazai's fingers, which were wrapped up a new set of bandages. What happened there? He finally asked, thinking of the mirror of a wrist, now standing broken in the bowels of the school. Dazai twitched, like he wanted to hide his hands beneath the desk. Severus stopped him with a heavy glare. Nothing, the boy grumbled out after a second. He shuffled in his seat, looking uncomfortable in a way that seemed not to be a lie. Severus leveled him with a glare. Again, Dazai squirmed in his seat. Something like horror began to consume Severus. Dazai was clever. He wouldn't be looking so obviously upset if this wasn't something big. Something like stealing the Philosopher's Stone, although if Quirrell really hadn't asked the boy to take it. That train of thought was abruptly cut off when Dazai mumbled, Why do you keep asking me about last night? I was with Blaze all yesterday, you know. Last night, Severus emphasized the words carefully. There was a major breach in Hogwarts security. He waited for a second to watch Dazai's expression, but the boy's frown was blank. I'm sure you can figure out why you are a major suspect. Dazai's brows furrowed, and Severus wondered if the snake was trying to parse out the meaning behind his words. After a second, Dazai blinked. Out after curfew, meetings with Quirrell, cuts on his fingers. Not to mention the other unusual circumstances surrounding Dazai's existence at Hogwarts. Dazai must have realized how suspicious he looked as well, because he repeated his alibi more forcefully. I was with Blaze all night. Mr. Zabini. Severus knew him, of course. An average student all around who had somehow become wrapped up with Dazai's personal band of chaos agents. Dazai nodded. His eyes flicked to the warmed tea. Severus sighed, then withdrew the honey from where he stored it. He raised it over Dazai's mug, but stopped before pouring any in. I told you I don't like honey, Dazai cut in, eyes lidded. He poured the honey in anyway. It was swirling around in the bitter tea, sweetening the brew when Severus slid it across the desk. Dazai took it between his bandaged fingers with a small performative frown on his lips. Steam spilled out of the mug and warmed over the boy's hands. Severus fixed his own tea and willed himself to keep from shouting. "Problem child," he said over a pillow of hot steam. "Do you expect me to believe an alibi coming from your best friend? Do you take me for an idiot?" There was a pause, where Dazai seemed to actually be mulling the question over. Severus had to bodily stop himself from snatching the boy's tea back angrily when he realized. Dazai offered an amused smirk, then took a slow sip of his tea. When he pulled the mug away from his face, his expression was distant and unreadable again. Cautious was the word that sprung to Severus's mind. Dazai was being cautious. "Blaze and I stayed awake all night," Dazai supplied, words clearly chosen with great care. He tapped a vague rhythm into the mug trapped between his palms. Severus's eyes immediately latched onto the bandages there. At the disbelieving gaze coming his way, Dazai doubled down. "I'm not lying about that." He wasn't. Dazai was fantastic at putting on masks, but Severus didn't think the boy was lying now. It was in the way that Dazai looked distinctly nervous that really convinced Severus. Not nervous like he was seconds from being caught in a lie, but nervous like he was about to admit to something he really didn't want to say. Severus held his breath, waiting for the confession that would follow. "He took my knife away," Dazai said, voice little more than a petulant whisper now. He flexed his fingers out, showing off the bandages there. "Then bothered me about not doing stupid things all night long." The realization crashed down on Severus like a bag of stones. Dazai averted his gaze and hid behind his mug. The motion pulled Dazai's fingers into view once again. The fresh bandages there. Severus had thought they might have been from the shattered mirror, but the tremor in Dazai's hands and the waver in his voice. No. Those bandages weren't covering up glass cuts, were they? Cuts on his hands, a protective friend keeping midnight vigil, a confiscated knife, and Poppy's concerned warnings echoed in his head once again. "Scars," she had said, "self-harm scars." Severus drew in a deep breath, then let it out as slow as he dared. When he finished, a new type of eager tension had filled out his shoulders. Carefully, he set his mug down on the desk with a small click of the porcelain on cold wood. This was another problem that Severus clearly hadn't interfered with soon enough. "Last night," Severus said slowly, thoughtfully, "you were up late, cutting yourself." Dazai blinked at him, then looked away again. His shoulders were a stiff, straight arrow of tension. A billow of steam smothered his expression from view. "Whatever," he said, voice light. "I'm just letting you know since I do have an alibi." An alibi. When his student nodded, Severus had to bite back another sigh. "Okay." Severus bit his lip, unsure how to proceed. He'd been too quick to accuse Dazai of stealing the stone. It was blatantly obvious now. Albus was right. No mere student could do such a thing, especially not one so clearly troubled as Dazai was. The realization mellowed him out and filled him with dread at the same time. Severus couldn't bring himself to admit to the mistake, and instead continued. "Mr. Zabini can confirm this?" Dazai bristled, letting out a pain-sounding snort. "I should hope not. Any friend of mine should know how to keep a secret." Severus frowned. "I would hope," he echoed, "that your friend would know that some problems are best referred to a responsible adult. Like Quirrell?" Dazai asked cheekily. "Like myself." Dazai huffed, obviously displeased, and kept his eyes planted firmly on the far wall. Severus pinched the bridge of his nose before wrapping both of his hands around the mug once again. "Mr. Dazai, look at me." Silence. Problem child. With a heavy breath, Dazai finally tore his eyes away from the spot they had distantly locked onto. He met Severus's stare head-on for a long second, before fiddling with his mug self-consciously. "I am." Severus trailed off, struggling to find words soft enough to share in a situation like this. Students didn't come to him about things like this. He was prickly and mean. Anyone could tell you that. but no one else was here to ask the hard questions. And Albus, though he may want to interrogate Dazai, could be so dense sometimes. Albus often failed to consider that this, the well-being of their students, was the bigger picture. Worried about you, he finished a second later. I only told you that because I thought it would make you stop asking annoying questions, but I can see now this was all a huge mistake. Severus felt sick. He took a calming sip of tea. This wasn't a mistake, I'm glad you told me. Dazai shuffled in his seat and Severus sighed again. I've let this go on long enough. We need to talk about your habits. Severus said it confidently, but he wasn't sure where to start. Hogwarts may be a fantastic place to learn magic, but the school had little to offer outside of that. Counseling, for example. Hogwarts didn't have a counselor. Severus was not certified to provide his students therapy. The best he could do was, whenever these urges to hurt yourself arise, I need you to seek out a professor, preferably either myself or Madame Pomfrey. Merlin knew that Albus couldn't provide any constructive mental health support, what with his looming big-picture complex. Sure. Dazai frowned into his tea, taking a near-silent sip of the honeyed brew. Severus watched him for a long moment. He got the feeling Dazai was merely humoring him, that this instruction would be disregarded immediately, just like at the beginning of the year with the infirmary. Visit one of us, Severus reiterated, trying to get across the severity of the situation. For anything. Got it, sir. Dazai replied a bit more forcefully now. There were other things that Severus hadn't forgotten either. Now, in the soft light of his office, Severus felt them come back at full force. All of those little red flags he had been compiling seemed more desperate for attention than ever. But against his better wishes, there wasn't time. The Philosopher's Stone was still missing. For now, Dazai's red flag collection would have to wait. Severus held his tongue. Good, he said, solemn. Severus leaned back in his seat. Then you are dismissed. Visit Poppy before returning to the library. Dazai blinked. He shook the surprise from his face almost immediately, though. Now? Don't you want me to call Blaze in for his interrogation? Severus shook his head. Even the biggest problem child in all of Hogwarts couldn't have breached security to this extent, he admitted. I see no reason to drag on the interrogation further. Unless you're keeping information from me, brat. Nope. Dazai hummed, clearly trying to put some cheer back into his voice now that he was free to leave. Waving him off, Severus let Dazai go. His student hurried to leave, not wasting time in making his exit. Once the door was shut, Severus was locked in mute solitude. Steam poured out of the mugs. Severus noticed with a jolt of amusement that, despite his protests, Dazai had in fact drank most of his tea. The observation was almost immediately smothered by the sobering, lingering knowledge that Dazai wasn't safe. Leaning forward, Severus pressed his palms into his eyes. Later, Severus would learn that Dazai never made it to see Poppy. There would be panic and shouted commands and running. There would be a student begging him to take action. 2 students missing. That damned bigger picture. But that was a panic yet to come. For now, Severus sat in his office alone. The silence was as oppressive as it was unhelpful. Thank you and subscribe for more Bungo Stray Dogs fanfictions. Let me know what was your favorite scene.